Today is Monday, July 14th, 2025. This is Quick Start from CBN News. I'm Dan Andros. Chip and Joe Gaines are getting some serious pushback after releasing a trailer for their new show. We'll have that top story and more on today's podcast, where we bring you news from a Christian perspective. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a rating. You can email us your thoughts as well. quickstartpodcast@cbn.org. We are getting through all the news of the day, each and every weekday, bright and early here on Quick Start. Joining me today, CBN's Billy Hallowell. Billy, a lot to get to on the podcast today, including on the focus story, an ex-LGBT activist who became a Christian is now facing a chaotic legal battle in Malta.
Yeah, this is a crazy case. We covered it back in 2023. We are doing a follow-up and had some really interesting comments from Matthew Grech. So we'll get into what he currently faces in his ongoing legal battle.
All right, looking forward to the details there in just a moment. Also coming up on the main thing, should girls be forced to compete against biological males in high school sports? The DOJ just took an unexpected stand. Madison Seals has more on that on today's main thing. All right, make sure you subscribe to all of our CBN News podcasts, Newsmakers, Faith and Culture, Navigating Trump 2.0, Heaven Meets Earth. You can find the links to all those great podcasts in the description of this and each and every Quick Start podcast episode. And with that, we are going to head to the news now in 90 seconds. And President Trump announced on Sunday that the U.S. will send Patriot missile systems to Ukraine, accusing Vladimir Putin of being two-faced. Quote, he talks nice, then bombs everybody in the evening, end quote. Trump said the European Union will reimburse the U.S. for the missile systems, calling the deal 100% paid for. The decision marks a stark shift as Trump grows frustrated with Putin's refusal to agree to a ceasefire, despite repeated attempts to broker peace. Ukrainian President Zelensky has been pleading for more advanced air defense as Russia continues daily missile and drone strikes. Trump will meet with NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte this week to discuss Ukraine and broader alliance strategy. And Chip and Joanna Gaines are facing backlash over a new show featuring a same-sex couple. The HGTV stars are under fire from Christians after their new reality series, Back to the Frontier, included a gay couple raising two boys in the trailer. The Magnolia Network show, now streaming on HBO Max, features three families living as 1800s homesteaders. Franklin Graham and many others pushed back publicly, and Chip Gaines spent the morning yesterday responding to people in the comments, doubling down. Those are just some of today's top headlines. You can check out more stories over at cbnnews.com. And it was interesting, Billy, because the trailer came out of nowhere. Nobody knew this show was coming. This was kind of off the larger radar with everything else going on. And it was pretty evident from the trailer that it appeared that they were just showing this gay couple, one out of three in this show, and it seemed like there was no comment on this particular lifestyle. It was just they were part of the show, and it was kind of like a lot of LGBT propaganda is just kind of jammed in there. And people were shocked that Chip and Joe Gaines that produced the show put this in here. And so they commented on it. And then Chip yesterday morning was responding to people, and he basically blamed Christians for being hateful, saying that these secular people haven't experienced vitriol and hate until they meet a modern American Christian. And a lot of people took issue with that comment because, listen, Billy, I mean, those of us in the news, we've noticed, and I don't know if everyone else has noticed, things like Pride Month always jammed in our faces, seemingly 24/7. But it's been this way. I mean, like, ask Jack Phillips if this is something that he's not experienced any hate. I mean, this movement has been targeting Christians for a long time now, and to act like it's Christians who are the ones to blame here it seemed a little bit off base here and not reading the room.
Yeah, well, I think not only not reading the room, but after you've gone through a controversy already, it's like, I don't understand how people
they tried
don't have...
I'm sorry to interrupt, Billy, but they tried to cancel Chip and Joe years ago for not featuring same-sex couples on Fixer Upper. Continue.
Well, and So yes, and that's the backdrop, right? So now they're featuring a same-sex couple, and you have this hoopla, and people are upset, which is understandable. They apparently weren't doing it before, but they didn't really speak out. He wrote a blog post after, and I forget all the details of it, but this is years ago now. But it was actually well written, and it was about respect and loving one another. And but this form of response of responding to this, it's not helpful. I mean, every part of this is unhelpful. The other piece is not only did they do this in the show, I don't have the exact wording in front of me, but this sort of post about, good family time spent together watching this show. A lot of people are like, wait a minute, this is not good family time.
Right.
You're leaving us. You're telling us to watch this with our kids, which would not be something that a lot of Christian families would want to do. And so I just think all of it is being handled poorly. Rather than putting these messages out on social media and responding to people, do an interview with somebody, talk to them about it, have a conversation. But at the end of the day, what's happening is people are upset because they're feeling like maybe Chip and Joanna Gaines are not who they thought they were. And if they are who people thought they were, then I think they owe it to people to have a conversation about that and explain it. And here's the bigger thing, and then I'll stop. But there's a lot to talk about here, I think, because it's actually an important issue. At the end of the day, they're going to offend somebody, right? And so they have to make a decision. Either they're going to offend the LGBTQ crowd by not affirming at this point, because it feels like they have, or they're going to offend Christians by affirming. And so at some point, they've got to take a position and a stand, and he can't be blaming Christians for their reaction to something he should know they're going to react to.
Right. They absolutely knew this was going to happen. It's very, very difficult to believe that this is some shocking response that they had no idea was coming. So why did you do it this way? Why didn't you give people a heads up ahead of time saying, hey, we've decided to go this route. Here's why. He actually tweeted in one of the responses. He was responding to a lot of people yesterday morning, and he said, well, maybe there's more to the story here. Well, it's like, hey, you're online right now, Chip. Why don't you tell people what the more to the story is? We'd like to know. And he didn't end up explaining it. And it's like, it just leaves you scratching your head. Well, what is it? Are you affirming now? Is there some change in your stance? Are you doing this just to get attention for your show? Maybe not enough people have been watching their network. I don't know. And they just knew that this would rile people up and get attention. I don't know. But it certainly leaves more questions than answers. And definitely, given the amount of propaganda that Christian families, let's be honest, Billy. I mean, you're a parent trying to watch stuff with your kids, trying to find stuff that's not infected with pushing different forms of sexuality that are outside the biblical view is almost impossible at this point. I mean, you can't even watch Star Wars without them trying to show me gay space aliens. It's like, you can't avoid it. And then when you have a Christian couple who Christians have loved, for them to do it, I think they're underestimating just how frustrating that is.
Well, and that is the thing here too, because nobody should be hateful and nasty and whatever, but having a theological debate and discussion, that is not hateful. Reacting to content that you're shocked that people you've loved and thought were representatives of the faith they're doing something suddenly that seems to contradict that in people's eyes. There's nothing wrong with asking those questions. So, look, Chip and Joanna seem like very nice people. They've professed faith over the years. I'm hopeful that when the dust settles on this, there can be a conversation and maybe an explanation can be given that makes sense. But right now you have a show that was peddled as something that is safe for families that clearly for Christians feels unsafe or inappropriate for them to watch with their kids. And so, we'll have to see where this one goes.
Yeah, we'll keep an eye on it and keep you up to date over at cbnnews.com, faithwire.com. All right, we are going to head to the focus story now. And as we talked about there at the top, there's an ex-LGBT activist who's facing a legal battle in Malta over so-called conversion therapy and practices. Tell me about what's going on here.
Yeah, we covered this story back in 2023, and I wanted to reach out to Matthew Grech. He's at the center of this. He is that ex-LGBTQ activist that you mentioned, and he faces potential prison time, also fines for sharing his testimony. He's heading back to court on July, I think it's on the 16th, he'll be heading back to court, and this is the 12th time he has gone to court over this because this case continues to stretch on. It's been years long. What he's being accused of, again, 5 months in jail potentially and fines, is advertising so-called conversion practices. In 2016, this is sort of the backdrop, Malta became the first European Union country to ban any attempt to change, repress, or eliminate a person's sexual orientation, their gender identity, or their gender expression. And so obviously this is quote unquote conversion therapy. Whenever you're trying to help somebody take a different position on those things, they will come after you. This is illegal in Malta. And so he ended up, because he went on a show, he went on a program, and he was answering questions about so-called conversion practices. He mentioned an organization in this interview. So imagine you do a media interview about his story, because again, he's an LGBTQ activist who lived a gay lifestyle, who became a Christian, walked away from that, and he's giving an interview about it. He mentioned this organization that supports men and women who want to leave that lifestyle behind. And because of that, he was actually reported by 3 people to the police. And then he ended up in this legal battle that has been ongoing. And so again, be praying for him this week, because he's heading back to court. Really just, it's a wild, wild story that he could face jail time over sharing those details in an interview.
Yeah, it really is. And what are some of the biggest issues at the center of the case that have Grech concerned?
Yeah, I mean, he thinks he has a solid case. And, the biggest thing is that this is a free speech issue, right? We're seeing all over Europe these restrictions that continue to happen, whether it's buffer zones around abortion clinics or whether it's a case like this. But really, this has had him very, very concerned, because he's worried about what happens next. His case is really unique. He said it may be the most unique in the world in terms of somebody being held up on charges over sharing these so-called conversion practices the way that he did in an interview. So he's deeply, deeply concerned about just the chilling effect that this could have, on not just his life, obviously, right? He could go to jail or he could face these fines. But if this is a test case, what comes next if he loses this legal battle?
Yeah, and what's the most chilling facet of this case? Because this is obviously a concerning one.
Yeah, so obviously the things we just mentioned are certainly chilling, but the biggest thing that he talked about, and this was interesting, he did this interview, right, with a media outlet, ended up in trouble. Now all of these other media outlets have gone silent. He said he's not been invited to do media in Malta because they're afraid, he believes. They're afraid of his case, because if they talk about it, are they advertising so-called conversion therapy? So he said the television broadcasts and the stations are so afraid to do that only one side is being told now. That the other side, his side, is, he said, I feel grieved. He was like, for my country, for my nation, because Malta deserves to hear both sides. And this was really interesting. He said, frankly, when I was younger, I wish that somebody told me that there was a way out of homosexuality, because I would have chosen it. I'd never wanted to be a victim of unwanted sexuality in my life. And that was so interesting to me, because, obviously when you talk about leaving this lifestyle behind, that doesn't mean you're not tempted still. It doesn't mean you're not struggling still. It means that you're putting God's order first, that you're realigning your thinking on what is moral and right, and the way that you're going to behave as a result of it. And so it's interesting, because he was saying, look, I wish that I would have heard this. And so he's grieved over the fact that people are actually not hearing the truth because of how this case is being handled.
Yeah. I mean, it's really disturbing on so many fronts. And, we just got done talking about the Chip and Joe story. And man, you look at the influence that these activists have had on not only in America, but we see it overseas, and it's even worse overseas in these different countries. And just letting this viewpoint sort of get out there, I think, is something that all Christians should be watching and should be carefully considering, because the more inroads we allow here in America, the faster we're going to find this at our own doorstep.
Absolutely. And I think here's the thing. This should concern everybody, whether you're an LGBTQ activist or a Christian, the fact that people over speech and ideas, and you might not agree that somebody wants to have a different lifestyle, or they want to leave behind a trans identity. You might not like that, but that doesn't matter, because at the end of the day, this is about liberty and freedom. And the same thing that's happening to him could so easily happen if the tides turn to an LGBTQ activist or to somebody else simply for speaking their mind. So this is actually a bigger, broader issue than just religious liberty and truth, which of course, we know those things are important as Christians, and especially the truth on these issues, but actually it should concern anybody regardless of what they believe or think.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, this is one we will definitely be keeping a close eye on. Billy, thanks so much for bringing us this update on the podcast today. All right, that's going to lead us into the main thing now. And the Justice Department Civil Rights Division sued the California Department of Education last week to enforce Title IX and protect California female student athletes from competing against males on female high school sports teams. Sherry Few with the U.S. Parents Involved in Education joins Madison Seals to discuss on today's main thing.
Sherry, this lawsuit doesn't come as a surprise since President Trump signed an executive order back in February that bars federal funding from schools that allow trans girls and women to compete on female school sports teams. And since the California Department of Education is still receiving billions of dollars from the government this year, they should be following guidelines. How far do you think California is willing to go in defying federal guidelines?
Well, it appears that they're willing to stand their ground and, continue down that left path that they've chosen. And, they've refused to comply. And we've got Newsom, a potential presidential nominee for the Democrats. And obviously he's doing a lot of grandstanding to promote his political platform. And it's kind of interesting because, he was on the conservative Charlie Kirk's show and said something very different than what he's saying now to the Department of Ed. He clearly said that it was unfair and very unfair, he said. And yet now, as a state governor, when the Department of Ed said, well, we want you to comply with Title IX, so it's really, it's beyond the executive order, it's about complying with federal law. And so they said, we want you to sign this resolution saying that you will comply with Title IX and not allow men to compete in women's sports and keep them out of their spaces, meaning locker rooms and bathrooms as well. And so the California governor responded and said, we're not going to do that. We're not going to sign a resolution, and we're planning to stand our ground. And then by the middle of the week, they have slapped a lawsuit on them. So the Department of Justice now is suing the state of California. So it does appear that they're willing to go as far as it takes to promote their left agenda.
Yeah, it really is so interesting. This seems to go deeper than just a disagreement on policy, since, like you said, Governor Newsom has previously admitted that it is deeply unfair to force women and girls to compete with men and boys in competitive sports. So what do you think Governor Newsom's hoping to accomplish by holding a strong stance against enforcing Title IX protections for women and girls? And part two of that, do you think that he's in the minority now, or do you think that that'll really have an impact on people?
Well, first of all, I think his only objective in all of this and everything we see him doing today is to secure the Democrat nomination for president. And so everything that he does is viewed through that lens. If you're a politician and you want the Democrat nomination, then you have to play to their base. And they're all supportive of the transgender ideology, which falls over into women's sports. But then again, we know that when he did the interview with Charlie Kirk, he obviously was trying to pander to the other side. So it is a difficult balance for a politician. But I do think it's all about politics for Governor Newsom. But I believe that the issue itself, as far as males not competing in female sports, is not it's a nonpartisan issue, it appears to me, because I'm seeing all over the country a different response, and particularly in the state of Washington. I've done a few interviews with some folks there, some that are on the school boards in Washington state. There are 24 school districts in Washington state that have come together and are filing a lawsuit against their state Department of Education. And so in a state like Washington that we know is very liberal, and schools typically go along with the liberal agenda, these school boards are coming together and saying, no, this is wrong. So there may be other left issues that are very strictly partisan, but I think in general, most people agree that this is wrong. And as Newsom originally stated, it is unfair, and it's even harmful to women and girls when boys and men compete in their sports, because obviously they're physically stronger. We've seen already some issues where girls were harmed in sports when a male athlete was allowed to play. And so I really think it is emerging as a nonpartisan issue. And so I think that Newsom is really on a tightrope here as far as his political career, because I don't think everyone in the Democrat Party agrees with their decision to continue to allow males to compete in female sports.
A spokesperson for Governor Newsom's office is trying to paint the state of California and their actions as protective of girls by saying this ongoing attack is a cynical attempt to distract from the Trump administration's defunding of nearly 3 million girls enrolled in California's public school. And of course, this is a common strategy that we see a lot used by the left to try to distract people and make them seem like they're the peacemakers, or they're the ones who are, taking care of women and girls and trying to protect them. But according to this complaint, the California Department of Education and the California Interscholastic Federation are discriminating against female student athletes by allowing males to compete against them. And of course, that deprives them of equal education and athletic opportunities that are protected under the law. And that's why the federal government is threatening to withhold the federal funding. So what role do you think Congress should play in defending women's rights?
This law, Title IX, was enacted more than 50 years ago. And so the landscape was very different then. But the intention of the law was to end discrimination for women in sports, because men had far more resources and they were paid better, and some of that still exists. But the whole idea with the law was to level the playing field for women when it comes to competing in sports as compared to men. So the law has been in place a very long time. And, the Biden administration came in and they tried to, through regulation, they tried to change the definition of sex, because Title IX says that you can't discriminate on the basis of sex. And the word sex is the medical term and the legal term for what is now being called gender. So male and female is sex. And so that's what the law states, is that you can't discriminate against sex. So Biden went in with his regulations and tried to redefine sex to include gender identity and sexual orientation. And by the way, they withdrew those regulations right before Trump came in. There were several federal courts that rejected this idea. They said that they could not change the definition of the law. So Congress passed this law decades ago, and it's never been changed or amended. And I'm really glad that the courts stood their ground as far as not allowing the Biden administration to essentially rewrite the law. And then, of course, Trump came in with his executive order to further support this initiative. But if I'm not mistaken, this lawsuit is more about the violation of federal law than it is the executive order, which is, it's criminal. So I'm not sure what the consequences will be, but I think they may be even bigger than losing funding when you consider violating federal law. And that's what the lawsuit's about. And so one other thing I think is important to mention is that the resolution that the U.S. Department of Education sent to California, and they sent it to several schools that they knew were violating the law and the executive order, and it asked them to do three things: to stop allowing men to compete in women's sports and use their spaces, and to restore any female records that were overwritten by men, and thirdly, apologize to women who were negatively impacted by the state's policies. So we know that the University of Pennsylvania has already complied with this resolution, and they have reversed some of the awards that were given to males that were competing in female sports. They've taken those away from them and restored the women's rightful position in those competitions, and have apologized. So I think it's great that they set that precedent. Obviously, California is not willing to do that. We know that the state of Maine was also sued in April. And so there are several states that are affected by this. And it is now up to the Department of Justice to ensure that states are complying with the law when it comes to this issue.
I'd appreciate that conversation, Madison. And that's going to leave us with time on the podcast today for one last thing.
We've got 2 Timothy 1:7. For the Spirit God gave us does not make us timid, but gives us power, love, and self-discipline. Look, we don't need to be afraid, overtaken by fear. We've got to speak the truth, and we can get power and self-discipline in that process from God, which is pretty amazing.
Amen. Good spot to leave it as we see the pressures that are mounting in culture today for Christians to buckle under the weight of cultural pressures and stand firm in Scripture, no matter what the landscape looks like. God's will always be done. All right. We are going to call it a podcast. As always, get on over to cbnnews.com, faithright.com for more news from a Christian perspective. See you back here tomorrow. God bless.